In 1948, 35,000 people lived in Vanport, Oregon by nightfall on May 30th. Every single one of them was gone. And so was the city. Not abandoned. Not evacuated over weeks or months. Erased. In a matter of hours, the second largest city in the entire state of Oregon ceased to exist. The Columbia River broke through a railroad embankment at 4:17 in the afternoon, and within minutes, water 10 feet deep was moving through living rooms, schoolhouses, and grocery stores. The official death count was 15. 15 in a city of 35,000, hit by a wall of water with almost no warning. The Red Cross estimated the number was higher. How much higher has never been established. And in the decades since, the state of Oregon has treated the destruction of its second largest city with a silence so consistent it starts to feel structural. The city of Vanport was not a small settlement. It was not a temporary encampment. At its peak during the Second World War, it held nearly 40,000 residents, making it the largest public housing project in the United States. It had schools, it had a hospital, a post office, a 500-seat theatre, 9 recreational centres, and a childcare system that was considered one of the most progressive in the country. It was built in 110 days during 1942 and 1943 by the Housing Authority of Portland, designed by the same architects who would go on to shape mid-century urban planning across the Pacific Northwest. The buildings were wood frame, built fast but built to code, arranged along a grid system that sat on a low-lying floodplain between the Columbia River and the Columbia Slough. The location was deliberate. Vanport was built to house the workers who built the Kaiser shipyards, the largest shipbuilding operation in the world at the time, producing escort carriers and Liberty ships at a rate that astonished military planners. But here is the detail that changes the texture of the story. By 1948, the wartime shipbuilding boom was over. The Kaiser yards had slowed dramatically, and the population of Vanport had shifted. During the war, black workers had migrated to Portland from across the South and Midwest, recruited by Kaiser with promises of steady work and housing. Portland itself was, and this is documented in its own city charter, until 1926, a city that had an explicit exclusion law prohibiting black residents. Oregon's original state constitution, ratified in 1857, contained a racial exclusion clause that was not formally repealed until 1926. The culture of that clause did not evaporate with its legal removal. Black families arriving in Portland during the war were systematically directed to Vanport, not invited to live throughout the city, directed to the floodplain. By 1948, Vanport's population was roughly 40% black, in a state where black residents made up less than 1% of the total population. The second largest city in Oregon was, by measurable demographic fact, the centre of black life in the entire state. And then it was underwater. The timeline of May 30th, 1948 deserves careful examination. The Columbia River had been running high for weeks. Snowpack in the mountains that spring was extraordinary, and the Army Corps of Engineers had been monitoring water levels with increasing concern throughout May. On May 28th, the Corps issued warnings about dangerously high water along several points of the Columbia. The Housing Authority of Portland, which administered Vanport, received these warnings. On the morning of May 30th, Memorial Day, the Housing Authority posted a notice to Vanport residents. The notice read, in part, "Remember, Dikes are safe at present. You will be warned if necessary. You will have time to leave. Don't get excited." That was posted at approximately 11:30 in the morning. At 4:17 that afternoon, a section of the railroad embankment along the western edge of the city gave way. Residents reported hearing what sounded like a freight train. The water entered from the west and moved east at an estimated speed of 10 to 15 miles per hour. Within 35 minutes, most of Vanport was submerged. Within 90 minutes, the city was gone. The notice posted that "Morning, you will be warned if necessary" became, for many residents, the only official communication they ever received. Consider the sequence. The Army Corps of Engineers issues flood warnings on May 28th. The Housing Authority tells residents on the morning of May 30th that dikes are safe and there is no need for alarm. Less than 5 hours later, the dikes fail. No evacuation order is issued. No sirens are activated. No buses are deployed. 35,000 people are left to flee on their own, many of them on foot, carrying children, heading for higher ground that in some directions was more than a mile away through rising water. And the official death toll, published by the Housing Authority and adopted by the state, was 15. That number 15 is where the investigation deepens, because almost no one who has studied the flood carefully believes it. The Red Cross, which operated the relief shelters after the disaster, publicly stated that the actual toll was likely much higher, but could not be confirmed because the city's own record-keeping was destroyed in the flood. Census records for Vanport's residents, which were maintained in municipal buildings within the city itself, were lost. The Housing Authority's internal documentation about who lived in which unit was stored in offices that were among the first structures hit by the water. In other words, the administrative system that could have confirmed how many people lived in Vanport on May 30th was itself destroyed by the event that killed them. And in the absence of those records, the official count was set at 15 and was never formally revised. Not in the 1950s. Not in the 1960s. Not as of the most recent State Historical Review. 15. There is a second pattern layered inside this one, and it operates on a different timescale. After the flood, the surviving residents of Vanport, many of them black families who had been in Oregon for less than a decade, needed somewhere to live. Portland, the nearest city, had a well-documented system of racial housing covenants. These were private agreements written into property deeds that prohibited the sale or rental of homes to non-white buyers. By 1948, an estimated 80% of Portland's residential neighborhoods carried some form of racial covenant in their deed language. These covenants were technically unenforceable after the Supreme Court's 1948 decision in Shelley v. Kramer, handed down just 3 weeks before the Vanport flood. But their practical effect persisted for decades. Real estate agents continued to steer black families away from covenant neighborhoods. Banks continued to deny mortgage applications in redlined districts. The Federal Housing Administration's own underwriting manuals, used until the mid-1960s, explicitly referenced racial composition as a factor in property valuation. So the survivors of a destroyed city, a city that had been, by design, the only place in the state where black families were permitted to concentrate, emerged from that destruction into a housing market that was structurally engineered to exclude them. The Albina neighborhood of northeast Portland absorbed most of the displaced black families from Vanport. Albina was one of the only areas in the city without active racial covenants. Over the next 2 decades, Albina became the center of Portland's black community, developing its own businesses, churches, schools, and cultural institutions. And then, beginning in the late 1950s and accelerating through the 1960s, Portland began a series of urban renewal projects that systematically demolished large portions of Albina. The construction of the Memorial Coliseum in 1960 destroyed hundreds of homes and businesses in the heart of the neighborhood. The construction of Interstate 5, routed directly through Albina, displaced additional families. The Emmanuel Hospital expansion in the 1970s removed several more blocks. Each project was presented as modernization. Each project was approved by city planning commissions, and each project disproportionately targeted the one neighborhood where the survivors of Vanport and their children had built something new. The sequence is not ambiguous. Vanport concentrates a population. A flood destroys the concentration. Housing covenants funnel the survivors into a single neighborhood. Urban renewal dismantles that neighborhood over the next 30 years. Where these two patterns converge, the destruction of Vanport and the systematic dismantling of Albina, is in the infrastructure of memory itself. What happens to a community's history when the physical places that held it are removed, not once, but twice in a single generation? The schools where children learned in Vanport are underwater. The churches where families gathered in Albina are parking lots. The documents that recorded who lived where, who owned what, who was present, and who was missing those documents were destroyed by floodwater in 1948 and by bulldozers in 1962. There is a term in archival science for this kind of loss. It is called a documentary void. It means the absence is not merely unfortunate. It is functionally irreversible. You cannot reconstruct a community's record from silence. You can interview survivors, and oral historians have done extraordinary work in this area, particularly through the Vanport Mosaic project and the Oregon Historical Society's collections. But oral history is, by its nature, partial. It captures individual memory. It does not replace census data, property records, birth and death certificates, school enrollment figures, and municipal documentation. Those are gone, and their absence means that certain questions, how many people actually died on May 30th? How many families were displaced from Albina in total? What was the cumulative economic loss to Portland's black community across both events? May never be answerable with archival precision. The suppression of Vanport's memory in Oregon's public narrative is not a matter of conspiracy. It is a matter of institutional inertia compounded by strategic omission. For decades, Oregon's state history curriculum made little or no mention of the Vanport flood. The Oregon Encyclopedia, maintained by Portland State University, now contains detailed entries on Vanport, but these are relatively recent additions. The state's official historical markers at the Vanport site were not installed until 2017-60, 9 years after the flood. The Portland city government did not issue a formal acknowledgement of the racial dimensions of the Vanport disaster until the 21st century. This is not the behaviour of a system that has processed its history. This is the behaviour of a system that has filed it away. And there are institutional patterns beyond Oregon that echo the same structure. In 1921, the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, one of the wealthiest black communities in the United States, was destroyed in a massacre that killed an estimated 300 people and left 10,000 homeless. For decades, the Tulsa Race Massacre was absent from Oklahoma's state history textbooks. The mass graves were not formally investigated until 2020. In 1927, the Great Mississippi Flood displaced hundreds of thousands of people across the South, with black sharecroppers disproportionately affected, forced into relief camps where conditions were so brutal that the NAACP filed formal complaints with the federal government. The political aftermath of that flood reshaped the 1928 presidential election, but not the living conditions of the displaced. In each case, the pattern is the same. A natural or man-made disaster disproportionately strikes a black community. The immediate destruction is followed by an institutional failure to record, count, or compensate the losses accurately, and the long-term reconstruction systematically fails to restore what was taken. The question is not whether this pattern exists. The documentation is abundant. The question is what conclusion a careful observer is supposed to draw from its repetition across 7 decades and a dozen states. What survives of Vanport today is a landscape that has been repurposed so thoroughly that the erasure itself is invisible. The site where 35,000 people lived is now occupied by Portland International Raceway, Heron Lakes Golf Course, and a portion of the Portland Expo Center. There are no standing structures from the original city. The wooden buildings, designed for wartime speed rather than permanence, were either destroyed by the flood or demolished in the cleanup that followed. What remains are the concrete foundations of a few structures, visible in some aerial photographs, but largely inaccessible to the public. The slough that borders the site still runs along its original path, the railroad embankment that failed the physical point of failure that allowed the Columbia River to enter the city was rebuilt, reinforced, and is still in use. If you drive along North Portland's western edge, near the intersection of Force Avenue and North Broadacre Street, you are approximately at the point where the wall of water entered Vanport. There is no monument at that location. There is a levee it holds. Portland State University, which was originally founded in 1946 as the Vanport Extension Center, a college located within the city of Vanport itself, created to serve returning veterans, survived the flood only because its campus had been relocated to downtown Portland earlier that year. The university's origins in Vanport are noted in its institutional history, but are not prominently featured in its public identity. The institution that was born in the city outlived it. The students and faculty who would have been on campus during the flood were elsewhere by administrative accidents. That timing the move completed shortly before the destruction is one of the small ironies that survival deposits in the historical record, a reminder that proximity to catastrophe is often a matter of months, sometimes weeks. The oral histories that do survive are extraordinary in their specificity. Residents describe the sound of the water entering the city not a roar, but a hiss, as the flood moved through grass before it reached the streets. They describe carrying children on their shoulders through chest-deep water, walking toward the silhouette of higher ground that they could not be certain they would reach. They describe arriving at relief shelters and being told they could not return to search for missing family members because the area was unsafe. They describe waiting for official casualty lists that never came, because the lists were never compiled. One survivor, interviewed by the Oregon Historical Society in the 1990s, described spending 3 years after the flood trying to confirm whether her neighbor had lived or died. She never received an answer. Not from the housing authority, not from the Red Cross, not from the state. The city of Vanport existed for 5 years and 110 days. It was built to serve a war effort that needed ships faster than any nation had ever built them, and it was populated by workers who were told they were essential to the survival of democracy. When the war ended and the ships stopped, the workers became inconvenient. The floodplain became a question that nobody with institutional authority wanted to answer honestly, and when the river answered it instead, the count of the dead was set at a number so low it functions less as a statistic and more as a statement of priorities. There is a golf course where Vanport used to be. The fairways are green and level. Beneath them, if you were to dig, you would find the foundations of a city that housed more people than 90% of Oregon's current municipalities. No one is digging. The grass grows over everything, given enough time and enough silence. But the river still rises every spring, and the levee, rebuilt and reinforced, holds its position along the same line where it failed 77 years ago, the only structure at the site that remembers what it was built to prevent. 15 is still the official number.